In this tutorial, we're going to look at how to use the VLOOKUP function, how to graph using the minimum function, the if statement, and how to account for missing data in your formulas or your graphs, such as when an athlete misses a test, using the array formula and the NA message. On our team, testing occurs multiple times a year. We'll be using the 6K information from multiple tests with the values in the format of minutes, seconds, and tenths of a second, a common format for 500-meter rowing splits. Note the process and formulas used in this video can be applied to any situation when comparing numbers. Here we can see I've recorded the scores for the test at 500-meter intervals throughout the 6-kilometer test. This is our first test of the series, and I will have a tab for each test afterwards. On the test tab, scores are input, but I want to see a visual, such as a graph, of what the numbers mean. We're looking for a specific profile when doing our test, where it's slightly faster at the start and finish, with lower numbers, and a flat line in the middle. In this model, graphing is difficult for each student at once, so we make a graph that all athletes can use. All we need is to identify their scores and drag their scores to the cells that make our graph. To identify scores, each athlete is given a number, for instance, their student number. We are going to set up the data points we want to use below the testing data so that this is all in one place. So to insert our student number, I'm going to click on column A, insert, and I'm just going to, for simplicity's sake, call them student number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this is their student number. We are going to set up the data points we want to use below the testing data so that this is all in one place. Starting with the X and horizontal axis, I'm going to use my 500-meter intervals. So I'm just going to type in equals, and I'm going to copy the cell. So the cell means whatever is in C2 will now be in C11. I'm going to copy that all the way across. And now in D11, it's looking at D2, E11, E2, etc. In the next row, I want to use the scores from the individual I want to look at. To do this, I will use a formula called VLOOKUP. VLOOKUP is similar to looking up a person's name in a telephone book to get a phone number. VLOOKUP looks at a value in one column and finds its corresponding value in the same row in another column. Note, there's also a similar formula called HLOOKUP, which only differs in that it looks for a value in a row and then finds a corresponding value in the same column in another row. The formula VLOOKUP uses 4 pieces of information. Here we can see our formula where it's equals VLOOKUP bracket, and the first piece of information is the lookup value. The lookup value is your starting point. In our example, it is a personalized student numbers. For the lookup value, we cannot have any duplicates. The second piece of information in our formula is the table array. Table array is the range for your lookup table. Basically the top left corner to the bottom right hand corners of your data. For table array, 3 things you need to know. The left column must contain the values being referenced in the lookup value. So those are our student numbers. You cannot have any duplicate values in that left-hand column, as we've mentioned previously. And when referencing, you don't want the references to change when you drag formulas across rows or columns. Thus, you need to put $signs before and after the cell letter in the table array and lookup value so that your references don't shift. The third piece of information in our formula is the column index number. Column index number is the column number of the row you are looking up whose information you need. So for instance, if we're just looking to reply with our student number, it would be column index number 1. If it is the piece of information in our second column, the one to the right of our student numbers, it would be column index number 2. The last piece of information in our formula is the range lookup. Range lookup means how close a match should exist between your lookup value, so our lookup value, and the value in the leftmost column of your table array. If it requires an exact match, write false. If the range lookup is true, which is the default, the function will match the nearest value in the lookup value that is still less than the value you are looking for. Alright, now that we've looked at the VLOOKUP formula, we're going to choose a cell that's going to be our reference point for all the other cells. Let's choose this one, and to help identify it, I like to color it in. That way it's easier for our athletes or coaches to know what to do. I'll write a little note to help. Insert student number in yellow cell. Okay, so insert student number in yellow cell. If we wanted to put Sam's information, we're just going to have student number 1, and this is going to be our starting point for our reference. In this column, we're going to drag our splits. Again, I like to use it as a way of having all the information that I'm going to graph all in one spot instead of having it in multiple spots. I just find it easier to work with. So for my splits, we're going to use the formula equals, and we'll use our function tool, VLOOKUP, and my lookup array. So my lookup array, again, is a starting point, and I'm going to be looking up this cell right here. Next, for my table array, it's going to be from A2 all the way to N7. And my column index, remember it starts with the furthest left column of the table array. So this is column 1, 2, 3. If we're looking at splits between the 6,000 meter mark and the 5,500 meter mark to go, I need it in column 1, 2, 3 because I want this 210.3 to show up. So my column is going to be 3, and I want an exact answer, so I will put false in the range lookup. Hit enter. So we got a number, but not the number we're looking for. The problem is that this number is not in the same format we want to see it. We want to see our numbers in minutes, seconds, and tenths of a second. So I can right click, format cells, and I can go to custom minutes, seconds, and tenths of a second. There we go, my 210.3. Now that I've got the formula, I'm going to drag it across. Error messages. Let's have a look. Here this cell worked, and I go across. Now it's looking up C11, but we want to look up B11. What do we have to do? Well, we want to lock this cell. So in my formula, I'm going to lock B11 by putting dollar signs on either side of the B. So our B11 will now turn up in this one once I drag it across. The other problem is that my table array has changed from A2N7 to B2O7. So again, it's shifted 1 to the right. So I need to put dollar signs not only around my lookup value, but also my table array. Hit enter. Now I drag it across. Okay, we're moving somewhere. Not exactly where we want to go, but pretty close. So I've got 210.3, 210.3, 210.3, because if we look a little closer, the formula is the exact same. So while it's good that we didn't change our reference point, our column index number unfortunately did not change. So we'd have to manually go in here. And now we want column 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, enter 213.8, 213.8. This one's going to be column 5, 214.0, 214.0, etc. So we've changed a couple of them so far, but imagine if you had to change hundreds of these cells. There must be a better way. And of course, I have it for you. Dynamic columns. For our column index number, instead of having the column number, if we type in column, open and close bracket, hit enter, again we get our 210.3. If I now click on this and drag across, everything matches up. I've got my 211.7, 221.5, etc. So we're pretty good. The dynamic columns, what it is it lines up the formula column, bracket, bracket, to the column that it's in. If I wanted to get information that's not in the exact same column but is shifted over to the left, after this bracket, bracket, I would put in -1. Now, instead of seeing 210.3, and there's Sam. Because my reference is the column that I'm in, -1. The column that I'm in, -1. If I'd like to see this 217.1, it's a column that I'm in, +1, 2, 3. So instead of having -1, I'm going to put in +3. There's my 217.1 and 217.1 because it's 3 columns to the positive side over. 1, 2, 3. For our sake though, it works that our columns line up. So I'm just going to drag this cell backwards, and now I've got column, bracket, bracket on all of these. Let's see how it works if I change the number in the cell. So instead of having Sam's splits, I'm going to try putting in John's splits. I typed in John's splits, and let's see, 143.1, 47.7, 43.1, 47.7. It looks like they all line up. Here's our formula for our reference point. Now, I'd like to make a graph of this information. That was our goal. I'm going to highlight both rows. Click on charts. And for me, I like the line graph. Click on line graph. I'm going to right click. With Excel, it doesn't like seeing the information in 2 rows. It prefers to see it in 2 columns. So I'm just going to right click and select data. And I'm going to click on the switch row column. So that switches it from vertical columns information to horizontal rows of information. If I click on that, now we can see my splits are appearing right here, and I've got my distance markers on the bottom. I also just have one series and not multiple series like I had before. Here I had a whole bunch of series, and I'm going to switch back to just having one. So I can hit OK. And now I can add some features to my graph. So if I go to chart layout, I can add a chart title above the chart. And this is my 500 meter interval splits for 6K test. I can also add a horizontal title. This is my 500 meter intervals, and a vertical axis title. This is my 500 meter splits. I can remove the legend And I can also click on the line. I can right click, format data series. I like to see markers on it at each interval. Spread this out, make a nice big graph. It's easy for coaches and athletes to see what's happened. So I can see my markers, and I might even add information such as my data above each data point. Now athletes can come and they can just change to their student number, and they can look for their profiles. Each athlete can see how exactly they attacked each type of race. So in this case, Sam started out pretty well, and then just after halfway through the race, he got pretty tired and had to go a little bit easier for about 1,500 meters and then take it back down in the last 1,000 meters. Meanwhile, Tom, with student number 2, he started off a little bit easier than maybe he could have gone, and about just past halfway, he started to go faster and faster and had lots left in the tank at the end. John, he started off pretty well, then he took about 500 meters off, and his split went up, and then he came back down, tried to get it back, and he's kind of all over the map. Matt, he did reasonably well. He's a little bit faster at the start, then he went on to a pace. Again, we have to look at our scale, only about 4-second splits difference. He's doing pretty well, realizing that he's going a little bit easier than he could have gone, bringing it back down, had a little bit of a blip, and then came back down for the last 500 meters. And Rick started off pretty well, started to go up, has about a 7 split difference between his start and about halfway through the race. Again, not terrible. And he came back down and had some energy at the end. When athletes are able to see what they've done for the test, rather than just numbers, they can visually see what's happening. Then as a coach and an athlete, we can work to build on their profile for their next test. One other item that I like to add in is the average line. So my average is in column P. I'm again going to look up the VLOOKUP information equals, VLOOKUP is my most recently used one. My lookup value is right here. I should lock that value on B11. My table array all the way across. Again, I'm going to lock that table. And then my column is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So my column index is 16. And my range lookup, I'd like an exact one. I hit false. Again, my type of number is wrong. I can go under, instead of right clicking, number, custom, and there's my 2 minutes 0.6, and here Rick's average split was 2 minutes 0.6. I can simply drag this across, and I've got my 2 minutes 0.6 all the way. I drag it across so that way I can just simply make another line on my graph using this as my consistent line. To add it to the graph, I'm going to click on my chart. I'm going to right click, select data. I'm going to add a series and my Y values are going to be my averages. And I can click OK. Here we can see, here's my averages. I might right click this. I don't want to see the markers on it. No markers. And now I have a nice line of my average. And now I can see my start is below my average. And in the last 2,000 meters, again, I went below my average. I can do this with anyone. If I go back to Sam, here's Sam splits and his average of 2:18.9. So we can see he was below his average for a lot longer, but the last third of the race, he was well above his average. If we had our whole team, whether it's 5 athletes or 50 athletes, we can just assign them student numbers. They can put this number in, and that will change the information on the graph so they can see what their profile looks like to conduct other tests. When I do another test in 8 weeks, I'm just going to right click on my tab. I'm going to move or copy. I'm going to create a copy, move it to the end, hit OK. Now both of these tabs are the same, so I don't have to redo the formulas. Instead, I can just call this my April 2016 test. And I'm going to do one more. Move to the end, create a copy, and my June 2016. So I've imported other data that I had from other tests to make it go faster. And I'm going to just change my title here. This is going to be April. And this is June 2016. So now Sam can look back. He can see his first test was below his average. His second test, he did a little bit better. He was much closer to his average. And in his third test, he slowly went up to his average, went above it, and then came back down. So each time he improved his test. So the only downside to this is the way we currently have it set up for Sam to check each one of his tests. He has to scroll through each of these tabs. So what we want to do is show all of their final scores in one place. I'm going to create a new tab by hitting the plus sign, and I'm going to name it Historical Tests. I'm going to move it to the front of the line so that now I can put all my historical tests on this first tab, and as the years go on and the tests go on, they can be added down the line. When graphing in Excel, there are many ways to graph or chart information. You can use bar graphs, column, pie charts, area graphs, scatter plots, and many others. This tutorial will focus on line graphs and common challenges. It is important to remember that the y-axis is the vertical and the x-axis is horizontal. Alright, now that I've created a tab for my historical test, I'm just going to copy their name and student number, paste it into this new tab, and then I'm going to add in my test dates. So January 2016, April 2016. If I'd like it to actually show January 2016, I'd have to put a space bar first, January 2016. Otherwise, Excel recognizes it as a date format. Again, spacebar, April 2016, spacebar, June 2016. To get their scores, I'm going to use the VLOOKUP again, equals VLOOKUP. My lookup value is going to be A3. I'm not going to use a $sign because when I drag it down the column, I want the relative cell that it is referencing to also go down the cell. My table array, I'm going to click on January, highlight my values. Eventually I'm going to just get this total time right there. So my table array is the entire table, and my column index number is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, because I'm looking for the total time. I'm going to hit false, hit enter. Again, it doesn't like that format of number. I'm going to change that to minutes, seconds, and tenth of a second. There we go, 2746.5, 2746.5. If I drag this formula down, I've got 2338.1, 2205, 2602, and 2407. Here's the same values that I have. I'm going to do the same thing for the other tests. There we have it. 2437 and 2359, 2437 and 2359 for Rick. Now we can see all the final times side by side, and as the tests go on, we can just keep adding them to the right hand side. Imagine there are now 10 tests and 50 athletes. What else would a coach want to know? Well, if I was a coach, I'd like to know what their personal best score is, or their lowest score. If it's the lowest score, we can also think of it as the minimum. We have a function called the minimum function. The formula is simply equals minimum and then the range of cells where we're looking for the lowest number. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to insert a column beside their name. I'm going to call this their personal best, and I'm going to use the minimum formula equals min bracket my range of cells, close the bracket, enter. 2654.2 is the lowest. Yes, confirmed it is the lowest. We're going to drag it down the column and across the rows, and here we have our minimum function. The formula is changed with every row because I don't have the $sign around the letters, which is exactly what we're looking for. If we know that we're going to keep adding tests, I can also, instead of just stopping at F3, I can highlight further down. If I hit enter, again, this hasn't changed anything. Now that we know what their personal best is, we want to know when they pulled that test. We can create a formula to correspond the date to the score generated by the personal best column. Again, I'm going to insert a column. I'm going to call this date of personal best. If I don't want to make this any wider, I can wrap the text, I can center it, make everything nice and pretty. I can also, I like to highlight the column that's personal best. I can change the width of the columns by double clicking or moving them as wide and narrow as I like. If I double click, It'll go as wide as the widest information. I can add borders. I'll add a title, 6K test data, historical scores by athlete. This goes across multiple cells, so I'm just going to merge them. I can make it a little bit bigger. I can make them bold. All right, now that it looks a little bit cleaner, we need to add the date. We're going to use a new formula called the if function. For the if statement, the formula is equals if logical test, value if true, and value if false. Let's look at it a little more closely. The logical test in the formula refers to an expression or formula that will be evaluated as true or false. The value if true is if the result of the expression of the logical test is true, then whatever is written in here will appear. The value of false, again, depending on the result of the expression of the logical test, whatever is written here will appear. So for example, if C5 is greater than 49.5, the result will be pass if C5 is greater than 49.5, but if the value in C5 is less than 49.5, the value will be false and it will say fail. So for the if statement, we're going to type in here equals if bracket if our value in C3 equals our value in E3, if that statement is true, we're going to have it respond as E2. If it is false, I'm going to have it respond just as 0. Close the bracket, enter. Of course, 2654.2 is not the value in E2. Since we have more than one column, we want this number here of our personal best to be able to be compared to our April and June values. This formula just looks at the January values. What I'll have to do is add in the options to compare to each one of these. This formula is just for one of these. To add, I'm going to, after the option of E2, if it's false, rather than it returning a 0, I'm going to add in another if statement. So I'm going to say if bracket C3 equals F3, then I'm going to return the score F2, my April 2016 value. I can put my comma, and I opened up 1, 2 brackets, so I have to close 1, 2 brackets, hit enter. Again, I get a score of 0 because it's only compared to these two. I'm going to add in my G column. Again, just before the 0, I'm going to add in another if statement. If bracket C3 equals G3, then G2, if not, 0. I open up another bracket, so I have to close another bracket, hit enter, and now it says June 2016 because this is lined up with my third column here. So I can just drag this formula down, and it didn't work. If we look at the formula, what's happening is 2225.9, it comes up right here, and rather than returning June 2016, it's telling me 2654.2. The problem is I need to make an absolute reference for the cell I want returned. So I have to go back to my original formula, put dollar signs for each of my true statements, hit enter, and now if I drag it down, all of these are populated with actual dates. So now I can see the personal best, I can see the date of that personal best. If I want to look at this information as well, just to see what happens over time, because again, while we only have 3 tests, we might have 30 over the course of the years that we teach them, or 10 or 5, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to add in conditional formatting. For our purpose, we're going to simply compare the second column to the first column, and then the third column to the second. So I'm going to have my conditional formatting of this column. My first rule is going to be, I'm going to type in my own formula, so I'm going to use a formula to determine the cells, and I'm going to say if F3 is greater than E3, so equals F3 greater than E3. If that's the case, that means we've gone slower. Slower means red. I'm going to hit OK. If we look back, Sam went faster, Tom went faster, John went faster, Matt went faster, but Rick went slower. So far, so good. Add another rule. I can just go to more rules. Use a formula. I'm going to say equals F3. If F3 is instead of greater than E3, if now it's less than E3, so that means we've gone faster. Faster means go. Go means green. Hit OK. And there we have our conditional formatting. We're going to do the same thing for column G. And there we have conditional formatting for our test, and then we compare from the first column to the second and the second to the third. So we can see John improved from his first to his second, and that's why it's green, but in his third test he went a little bit slower, so it is red. Meanwhile, Rick, with his original time, he went slower in his second test, but then in his third test compared to his second, he went faster, so it's back to green. Just like we graphed individual tests on other tabs, we can graph our historical scores. I'm going to use the VLOOKUP function again. This cell right here is going to be my highlighted cell. So again, I'm going to write student number in yellow cell. To the right of the yellow cell equals E2, hit enter, and there's my date. I can drag it across. So I get January 2016, April 2016, June 2016, and then this is giving me some random information. I'm just going to delete it, hit enter. Under my first date, I'm going to type in another VLOOKUP formula, equals VLOOKUP. My lookup value is my cell B11. My table array can be A3 to G7. My column index can be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And my range lookup, again, is going to be false because I'd like an exact value. Right now there's an error message because I don't have anything to look up in my cell. So if I look up Sam's, I push enter. It gives me a number, not in the format I want. Custom, custom 2746.5, 2746.5. If I drag this across, again, I have some errors because it's now instead of B11, it is C11 and then D11. So back to my original formula, I'm going to put $signs, lock in my lookup value, and I'm going to lock in my table array. 2746.5, and I come across, it's again 2746.5 for all of these. If we recall before, instead of having column 5, and I'd have to change on every one of these, I can write in my dynamic columns and type in column, bracket, bracket, and now I look, if I want my January 2016 value, it is 2 columns over to the right, so I can write in plus 2, hit enter. I still have 2746.5, and if I drag it over, I get 2706 and 2654.2. Now I can create a graph. I'm going to highlight both of these rows, charts, line, just as before. Again, because we have our information in 2 rows, whereas it prefers columns, I'm going to right click, select data. I'm going to switch the row of columns. Now I've got one series, and if I look, I've got my 2746.5, my 2706, and my 2654.2. I hit OK. I can add in my chart title. So my axis on the horizontal is going to be my test date. On the vertical axis is my total time. My chart title, historical scores by athlete, and I'm going to remove my legend. I can also right click on the data, format it, and I can get my markers, and I can also add in my labels if I like. I can add them to the right, I can add them to the left, or above or below my scores. If I were to move the table, I can slide this across, make it a little bit bigger, and as we add more and more tests, then I'm hopeful to see what happens with this trend. One thing we can notice is my scale of the y-axis is generated automatically. This works very well until the difference between the highest point and the lowest point is more than 16.67% difference. So for instance, I'm going to put in 40 minutes to see what happens. I hit enter, and now my scale, you can see, goes all the way down to 0 because the difference between the highest value and the lowest value is more than 16.67%. I'm going to undo this, go back to my original score, Command Z, and there we go. Now what happens if we're missing scores? Let's say Sam doesn't have a score for test number 2. Because we're only looking at total time, I'm just going to delete this for now and come back to my historical tests where I've dragged that information, and here's test number 2 at 0.0.0. This score also alters his personal best because it sees it as the minimum. 0 is lower than any of these 2 numbers. It also added a 0 to my graph and that throws off my trend. We want to ignore this data point for all of these reasons. Let's start with the personal best. With my minimum formula, I'm going to add a couple of stipulations. Because I'm adding multiple things at once, I'm going to do what's called an array formula. An array formula allows you to perform several calculations to generate a single result. When using an array formula, rather than hitting enter after inputting the formula, the user needs to hold down Control or Command for Mac users, plus Shift plus Enter. The formula will now have squiggly brackets on either end called brace characters. On our sheet, we're going to add in multiple stimulations. So rather than just having the minimum of these scores, we need to add in a stipulation, an if statement basically, that it has to be greater than 0. So bear with me. Minimum, bracket, if, bracket, E3 to M3, or let's just go back and just use G3 right here. It doesn't really matter. If that's greater than 0, then if it's true, we want to return the value of E3. We want it to return the value of E3 to G3. Close the brackets. I've got 2 open brackets, 2 closed brackets. I hit enter. That didn't work. It says value. My problem is that I forgot to hold down the Control or Command button, Shift, and Enter. So if I go back to it, hit Command, Shift, Enter, and that time it worked. If I go and look at it, we can see here are my brace characters, the squiggly brackets on either end. I can drag this down, and now if I'm missing a test from Rick, his third test, if I delete that, on my historical test, that's a 0, but my lowest score is 2407.2, which happened in January 2016, and the formula is still putting back January 2016 based on the value of the personal best. So we fixed the data under personal best. I'm going to add conditional formatting. I'm going to add in a new formula for anything that shows up as 0. Instead of it being green or red, I like it to appear black. Highlight cell rules. If it's equal to 0, I'm going to custom format it, fill it in as black. Okay. So there we go. When Sam missed a test and his result was 0, it fills in as black. I'll do the same to this column. If it's equal to 0, custom format, fill black. Okay. And again, Rick's test is now turned black. Now that we've dealt with the information at the top here, we need to deal with our graph. As we can see, it plots the 0 from his second test for Sam, and that's thrown off our scale. It's taken everything out of whack with our trend, and basically it's not a good sign. We want our graph to ignore the 0 data points. To avoid them, we're going to add another row to our graphing of information and change the source of our graph from this row to our new row that allows us to have zeros hidden behind information. Because we want to ignore the 0 data points, we're going to add another row below our graphing information and then change the source of our graph, because we need to do this so that we can convert our zeros to be hidden and not used in the graph. We will use the if function to tell the cell if the value is 0, then we're going to hide this value. In Excel, the symbol to hide the information in that cell is the £n/a. Otherwise, we use the value that it reads. The £NA symbol gives the program an error value that means no value is available. It basically hides or ignores the cell. NA is a great way to mark empty cells so that you can avoid the problem of unintentionally including empty cells in your calculations. On our sheet, I'm going to add a title here saying graph this line, and I'm going to have a formula equals if bracket the value in C12 equals 0. So if that is true, we'd like it to return the pound NA. So that way that cell is hidden if it is 0. If it is not 0, anything other than 0, we want it to return the value that's in C12. Close the bracket, hit enter. Again, I'm going to change my type of number. And of course, because it's not a 0, it returned my 2746.5. If I were to drag this across, here I get NA because my formula is true. D12, here's D12, it equals 0, so it's going to return NA. Now let's have a look. It hasn't affected the graph yet because I have to change the source of my graph. So I'm going to right click on this, select data, and my Y values, instead of being C12 to E12, delete that, and I'm going to have C13 to E13. I'm going to close that, hit OK, and now I have my first test. My second test of 0 is ignored, and my last test in June shows up right here. Now, in a few months' time, you'll want to add another test. To do this, you can copy a previous test tab and rename. So my June, I'm going to again copy it. I'm going to move to the end with a copy. Let's call this August 2016. I can clear all this data in here and put in my new information. And then on the historical test tab, all I have to do is add a new date right here. So here I had June 2016 space August 2016. Here I use my VLOOKUP. I'm going to do the same thing here, equals VLOOKUP. I'd like to look up my student number. My table array goes back to August. I can highlight my whole table. My column index was number 15. And my range lookup is false. Again, change the number. $2654.2. We just kept the same data for now. That was the same as June. I can drag this down. I need to adjust my minimum range. Instead of just having E3 to G3, I need E3 to H3. Or like I said, I can extend as far as I like. If I just change it to H3, H3, don't forget the Command Shift Enter for the array function. Every time you change it, you have to hold down Command Shift Enter. I'm going to drag it down. So if this data here was 15 minutes, this should show up. And on my date of the personal best, it says 0.0.0 because I still have to add in the information for the test date of my personal best score. So if I click on it before the 0, right before the 0, I'm going to add in another if statement. if bracket C3 equals, now H3, I'm going to return, I'm going to lock in H2. If it's not H3, it's going to return a 0. I hit enter. It says there's an Excel problem with our formula. I forgot to put in a bracket. In this case, it added the extra closing bracket for me. I can drag this down, and now my score of 15 minutes appears as August 2016. For my graph, I can just click on one of them, drag it across. There's my date, June 2016. Now it's going to reference the next cell over, August 2016. For my values, I need to change my table array so it doesn't stop at G7. I want to stop at H7. So I'm just going to change this to H7, hit enter, and now I can drag this across. So all of my formulas have H7 on it. And my graphing line, I don't need to make any changes. So I can just simply drag it across. And then on my graph itself, I'm going to right click, select data, and I'm going to extend my Y values. So instead of C13 to E13, here's C13 to E13. I need to extend that to F13. So I can just type in here F13. We can see on my graph it has now captured this value. We also have to change the x-axis, the horizontal bar. Instead of C11 to E11, I need to include F11 as well. So I can put in here F11, and my date appears. I hit OK. Now the last thing I want to do is add conditional formatting. Just like before, I'm going to add in my rules, use a formula, and compare our current column to the column before. H3 greater than G3 is going to be red. Interesting. Our 15 here compared to the 0 is red. We didn't have that problem here because we entered it later. So we need to actually change our formula. We're going to add in a new formula, and we're going to use an if statement. So our formula is going to be equals if bracket G3 equals 0. So if the one before it equals 0, then what we want to do is compare H3 to F3. We're going to skip G altogether. So H3 greater than F3. So if H3 is greater than F3, it's going to be red. Otherwise, if G3 is not 0, then we're going to compare H3 to G3. H3 greater than G3. I can close my brackets, hit enter. Nothing's happened because these ones are all the same. But if I compare it now, and instead of having 26:54, I'm going to put in 28 minutes, and now this one's gone red. So far that formula has worked. Conditional formatting, more rules, we're going to do the opposite. Equals if bracket G3 equals 0, then we're going to compare H3, this time less than F3. But if it's not 0, then again we're going to compare H3 as hopefully being less than G3. This is good if it's less, so we're going to make it green, hit OK, and now we can see my 28 minutes is higher than this column before, so 28 is gone red. These ones are still white because they'd have no change compared to before, and we have not put in a specific rule for having the exact same time. And this one here with 15 minutes is going to be green because this one's 0, so it's comparing to the one before, and 15 is less than 2437.7. So what we'll want to do is change our formulas for each of these two conditional formattings to our new conditional formatting. As we move forward, we'll have future test going down the columns, and here I'll paste in all the formulas for our own reference. Here we can see all our formulas in brown, our conditional formatting for column H with the recent rules that I applied to ignore that 0, the formula for E3 to pull the data for each of the tests. I also have my minimum formula. That was my original formula, but then we changed it to our array formula, where we held down the control or command key, shift and enter, and if I click on it, we'll notice it's still squiggly brackets around it. And then to get the date of the personal best, depending if there's 1, 2, 3 columns or more, I have my formula for 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns. We can see each time before the 0 between 1 column and 2 columns, I've simply added in if whichever cell I'm referencing equals the new cell, then I'm going to lock it on the date above, and that's all I'm adding in every single time I add a test. And then my formulas in C 11, 12, and 13 are right here, and that should get you going. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.